online, delighted that you're with us, and I want you to know that we think of you and hope you sense God's love, even through the medium of Zoom and YouTube. Our second scripture lesson is taken from the book of Job, a very short passage, Job chapter 42, verses 2 to 6. And if you're looking it up, I don't have the page numbers there. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, but it's right before the book of Psalms, which makes it a little easier to find. Then Job answered the Lord, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you declare to me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear. Now my eye sees you. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I have been struggling lately, not so much with my faith in God, because I'm one of those people who just cannot not believe in God. Believe me, I've tried. because in some ways it would be so much easier, at least intellectually, in this secular society of ours, not to believe in an all-powerful, all-loving God. But I've been struggling, trying to make sense of God's actions and activity in this world of ours, or better put, lack of action, lack of activity. It started with my mother. My mother, as most of you know, is in a nursing home in Lunenburg. And for the past 15 years, she hasn't known me or anyone else for that matter. She just babbles incoherently. For over 3 years, she's not had any solid food, and she's become so crippled up in her wheelchair that her muscles have atrophied, become locked in place. She looks like someone from the television series The Walking Dead, and yet still she will not die, no matter how hard I pray for God to take her home. I only hope she has no awareness of her situation, because if she does, it would be a fate too terrible for me to contemplate. And my struggle has intensified with the situation in Ukraine. With every photograph and news story, I cry out, why? When I see pictures of young children being taken out of bombed-out buildings on stretchers, it seems so barbaric, so senseless. The age-old question of how to make sense of all the pain and suffering in this world of ours has been haunting me lately. And I wish I were a Hindu, where the pain and suffering in this life could be attributed to bad actions in a previous life. Or perhaps a Zoroastrian, who believes in two gods, a good God and an evil God, with humanity caught in the middle. Or a deist, who believes that perhaps God created the world, but then God has left the world to run itself. But I, alas, am an old-fashioned Christian who believes in an all-powerful, all-loving God. The God, as the mathematician Blaise Pascal once put it, not the deists or the Zoroastrians or the philosophers, but the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Ruth. In theological terms, my struggle is known as the problem of theodicy. That is, how can one reconcile all the pain and hardship and suffering in this world with belief in an all-powerful, all-loving God? And at this point, I should probably apologize to you, especially to Ruth, since it's a rather heavy subject, this problem of theodicy, for a fall church service when we're bidding you farewell. But I suspect I'm not alone in my struggling these days. As the Ukraine war shows no sign of stopping, COVID seems to be entering yet another wave, and inflation has raised its ugly head. So in the few minutes that we have together, I invite you to reflect with me on this issue of theodicy through the lens of the biblical book of Job. Now, the book of Job isn't read too much these days, but over the years and over the centuries, it's fascinated individuals who've tried to make sense of this problem of suffering and a good God. Carl Jung wrote a very interesting book about it, and before him, William Blake did a series of paintings and illustrations on the images and the message in the book of Job. And Handel, as all musicians know, based part of his great musical work, The Messiah, on it. And so I've been reading and rereading the book of Job, trying to find some answers. Now, like many biblical books, the book of Job is really an amalgam of many different authors, edited and put together in one book. In the case of the book of Job, it's fairly easy to disentangle two main sources that form our present biblical book, the book we find in our Bibles. The first source can be found in chapters 1 and 2, and in the very end of the closing chapter of the book of Job, chapter 42. You see, the Jewish people had a very strong belief that God rewarded the good and punished the bad. It was known as the Deuteronomic Code, and you can find this belief scattered throughout the Old Testament. The problem is that sometimes it didn't actually happen this way. It didn't seem to be true to the experience of the Jewish people. And so the opening chapter of the book of Job tells the story of good and of a religious man named Job who was so righteous that when his children had parties in their homes, he would offer sacrifices to God in case his children had said or done something inadvertently wrong and angered God. Well, one day, the fallen angel Satan is wandering around the world, and God boasts to Satan about how righteous Job is. And Satan replies, and I paraphrase, well, of course he's righteous, God. You've given him a large and happy family, lots of money. Take away that from him, and he won't be so righteous. He won't look so good. So God lets Satan do his worst, and Job receives news that all his children have been killed, his herds and wealth devastated and lost due to criminal attacks and natural disasters. But still Job remains faithful to God, crying out, naked I came into this earth, naked I shall return. There the Lord has given it, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so later, when there's another celestial meeting and Satan is present again, God points out rather triumphantly that Job persists in his integrity in spite of his hardships. And this time Satan responds, yes, but he left Job his health. Take away Job's health, and it will be a very different matter. And so Job is struck down with some sort of disease. In graphic imagery, the Bible portrays him sitting on a dung heap, scraping at his sores with a bit of broken pottery. And this is too much for his wife, who implores him to curse God and die. But still Job persists in his righteousness, replying to his wife, shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not the bad? And then the biblical author concludes, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Well, this interchange between Job and Satan and God takes place in the first two chapters of the present book of Job. And then at the very end of the book of Job, in the 42nd chapter, we have an account of how, because Job persisted in his righteousness, God gave him even more children and more wealth, double than what he had before. And so in that shortened form, this source for the story of Job serves as a sort of gloss on the belief that God rewards the good and punishes the bad, by admitting that sometimes it takes a little while for this to play out in life. And so the believer must learn to be patient and to trust, which is probably what the author of the book of James in the New Testament had in mind when he commended his readers to learn about the patience and the endurance of Job. But the fascinating part of the book of Job, for me at least, is not the first few chapters at the start, or the verse at the end, but rather the bulk of the book, which comes from a different source. Because, you see, starting at chapter 3, a very different Job emerges, the one who is patient. This Job curses the day he was born, and wishes he were dead in order to be freed from his hardships. And this outburst from Job, cursing the day he was born, was too much for Job's friends who come to comfort him. And after sitting silently by his side for 7 days, one after another they speak out in defense of the teaching that God rewards the good and punishes the bad, claiming that Job must have committed some sin, some secret sin that he's unaware of. And if Job just admits to this sin, then God will forgive him and restore his family and his wealth. But Job replies that in his observations, often the good go unrewarded in this life, and the bad go unpunished. In other words, the Deuteronomic Code, the belief that God rewards the good and punishes the bad, does not seem to ring true to Job, at least in this life. And in response, Job's friends double down on their argument, claiming one another, no, Job, you must have done something wrong. Just repent of it, and everything will be okay. And this pushes Job over the edge. And he finally bursts out that he is innocent of any wrongdoing, that it is not he who has done something wrong, but rather God who's done something wrong. In other words, not he who has sinned, but God who has sinned by punishing him unjustly. And at that, his friends fade away, and a series of conversations, or better yet, monologues between God and Job take place, following which Job declares himself satisfied. Well, I went back to these chapters recently, which record the conversations between Job and God, these monologues, trying to find answers for my personal struggles with what's going on in the world and with my mother. And though I've read and reread them several times, I could find no answer. And this, in spite of the passage which I read before my sermon this morning, where Job declares himself satisfied with these conversations. Was it simply, I thought to myself late one evening, was it simply a case of God beating Job down with his superior knowledge? Or, put it in a more positive way, Job finally realizing that as a finite creature, he couldn't really understand the infinite, that it was beyond his understanding. That would make sense of most of the verses of that passage I just read to you from the first part of chapter 42, except for the one verse that I chose as my sermon title this morning. Because after admitting that God's ways are at a level beyond which he can understand, nevertheless, Job states, not as a person beaten down by the mystery of it all, but as one who's found an answer to his questions. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. And he says this before he receives any more wealth or any more children, putting aside the fact that the birth of new children can never compensate for the loss of former ones. What answer did Job find? I thought to myself, lying in bed one night before sleep took over. And suddenly it came to me that Job didn't find an answer, but he did find a relationship. You see, according to Orthodox Jewish teaching, when Job blames God, Job should have been killed by God for his blasphemy. As Job's wife put it in chapter 2, curse God and die and get rid of all your problems that way. And in effect, Job does just that in the middle of the book of Job. He curses God. He calls God the sinner, not him. But Job isn't struck down by God. Instead, God enters into this strange conversation with Job. And Job enters into a relationship with God. And in that relationship, Job realizes in the midst of his suffering that he's not alone, that God is with him. And that makes all the difference. The novelist Taylor Caldwell has written a short biographical story of one Christmas when that realization came to her. I wish I had time to share the story with you this morning, but I don't. But I encourage you to read the story, My Christmas Miracle. Because in this short biographical story, written about the lowest point of her life when she was divorced, penniless, a single mother, Taylor Caldwell comes to the realization on Christmas Eve that, to use her words, I'm not alone at all. I was never alone. We are never alone. Not when the night is darkest, the world coldest, the world seemingly most indifferent, for this is still the time that God chooses. This is the same insight that Job had. And it may seem like thin gruel for those like myself looking for some sort of erudite, philosophical, and theological answer to the problem of theodicy. I thought so at first, when it came to me in the night that Job found this relationship. Then I remembered when my wife Kathy died at age 44, I turned to C.S. Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, for some comfort. And in this book, as only Lewis can do, he takes complex philosophical and theological arguments and he makes them sound simple as he writes about how to reconcile the concept of a good and loving God with all the tragedies and sorrows in this life. And I read it eager for answers, and it left me absolutely cold, even though I could grasp the intellectual depth of many of his arguments. And then, a few days later, I read a short book that he wrote after he wrote The Problem of Pain about the death of his own wife, called The Grief Observed. That little book, which begins with these words, "No one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear," has no philosophical arguments, no theological insight. It's just the story of one widower speaking to another widower. And in that relationship, suddenly, I didn't feel so all alone. I still long for theological and philosophical answers to this problem of suffering and a good God. That's how I'm made. But I acknowledge that the most important answer will never be a theological or philosophical one, but a relational one. The assurance that we are not alone, not even when the night is darkest, the world seemingly the most indifferent, for this is still the time God chooses. "I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear," Job writes, "but now my eye sees you." The eyes of my heart, my spirit, my soul. Annie Hopkins was a prolific hymn writer. She started writing hymns at age 24, and the hymn that we're going to close with this morning is one of her best known ones, translated into more languages than any other hymn at the time of her death. In it, she gives voice to the truth of being in relationship with God. The fact that the most important things in this life, those are important things of faith, are in the end relational. May the sun shine warmly on your face. Until we meet again, may God hold you safely in the hollow of his hand.